Hello, everyone. Welcome to Design Fictions, Future Epidemiologies, Ethical Responses, and Public Health. For those of you returning to the session, it's wonderful to have you back. And a warm welcome to those of you joining the series for the first time. This studio session series is co-presented by the UC San Diego Design Lab and the Visual Arts Speculative Design Program. The UC San Diego Design Lab is a center for human and user-centered design research, education, and community, focused particularly on design for large-scale socio-technical systems. And the Visual Arts Speculative Design Program is a track within the Visual Arts Department that brings together art, media, and design futuring methods. This series responds to a number of inquiries that have been at the forefront of conversations within the Design Lab this year: how to design for the redistribution of power, how to design against privilege and bias, how to support ethical responses to complex situations across scales, all here in the context of the pandemic. So it is a studio session series, so there'll be a lecture and then a workshop portion, but in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, we encourage you to ask questions, seek clarification if terms don't make sense, but also be open to challenging some of your deepest held presumptions. For those of you who requested closed captioning, you can click on the live button on the top of your screen and you should see a transcription pop up in a new tab. And please note that we are recording these sessions and we will post them to the website when the series is over, when the videos get up, and we will send you an email also, so you can check them out after they're done. I've had the pleasure of co-producing this series with my fellow visual arts PhD candidate, Jonah Gray, under the curatorial leadership of Lisa Cartwright, and who's also our speaker, and by the instigation of the Design Lab's Camille Nebeker, who will host next week's session. And so again, thanks to the Design Lab and Visual Arts Department for their support. And for a brief introduction of today's session, called Health Surveillance Infodemic, Design Fiction by Numbers, with Lisa Cartwright. And Lisa is known for her writing about visual culture and a body of work in feminist science and technology studies, working at the intersection of art and medical history and critical theory. She is currently Professor of Visual Arts at UCSD with additional appointments in the Department of Communication and the Graduate Science Studies program, and an affiliation with the program in Critical Gender Studies. So pleasure to be with you today, Lisa. Thank you so much, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Jonah, for organizing this series. I think this is probably the first kind of prolonged engagement of visual arts faculty in a series with the Design Lab, but I know that Stephanie and Jonah, you've been involved with the Design Lab for a long time, and we're really looking to strengthen that connection. So thank you for setting the pace for us and for bringing us into the loop this summer. We conceived these workshops as student-oriented, and I'm staying true to that agenda so that we can give our students in the design minor and the design major in Viz, the design minor in Cog, some ways over the summer, because of course it's still our summer here until October 1st, to kind of think through some practical design problems and issues. I'm a spec design area head in a kind of managerial role doing that. I'm a media theorist. I'm not a designer. I'm not a design theorist per se. And so my talk is coming very much from a longer history of work on health communication from a humanities perspective. So I'm going to share my screen and share my PowerPoint and work from there. Just bear with me while I sit up a bit. If you have questions or comments, I won't be monitoring the participants or chat areas of Zoom, so please feel free to just interrupt me. I consider this to be very informal and will not be offended if I'm interrupted with questions or comments. And for those of you who are using transcription, relying on transcription, I have transcription on my PowerPoint. So I'm working here around the concept of health surveillance and infodemic, the concept of infodemic specifically, and the idea of doing design fiction with numbers. And this presentation is drawing on work that I've done primarily around hepatitis C for over a decade, but I won't be talking much about hepatitis C. I'll be talking about SARS. And it's also a presentation that I put together after a short dialogue with Camille Nedeker, in which we're interested in trying to make connections between visual arts and the kinds of cultural theories, narrative theories that I'll be introducing here, and the work that Camille is doing around COVID tracking apps specifically, and the ethics of COVID tracking apps. So my talk is kind of in conjunction with hers, although we haven't worked out those connections yet. We're in a very early stage of conversation. So I'm going to start with the term infodemic. And Merriam-Webster notes that they haven't entered the term yet into the dictionary, but they write, it's a word we're closely watching because it's appearing in some prominent places. And of course, it's a combination of epidemic and pandemic. And Merriam-Webster is taking note in 2020. I'll soon be explaining the deeper history of the term. But although Merriam-Webster hasn't entered it into the dictionary yet, Wiktionary, of course, has, with the definition, an excessive amount of information concerning a problem such that the solution is made more difficult. And a second definition, a wide and rapid spread of misinformation. Those two definitions, specifically the second one, come directly from the World Health Organization. And this is a graphic advertising a conference that the World Health Organization held about 2 months ago. And the conference was devoted to the problem of the infodemic. And so for the World Health Organization, the infodemic is demonic, is an unstoppable force that they are hell-bent on bringing it under control. And it's characterized here in a graphic that shows a person of color holding a phone that is apparently speaking. We see the sound lines coming out of it, and overwhelmed, being bowled over by a wide range of media, data, information, symbols, sign systems, and platforms. And I want to point out that this graphic is really a problem. That it's a graphic by Sam Brad, who put it together for The Who, and it's his company is Visuals for a Better World, and I think we really need to think more seriously about what the visuals signify here, because there's the suggestion that information is somehow on par with data, is somehow on par with symbols and sign systems, is somehow on par with platforms, and that all of these things converge together and overwhelm us, and that this is a negative situation. And I want to take issue with this throughout the talk, and I'm going to be taking issue with the World Health Organization's approach to information and data and numbers. So there's a concept problem that information is what is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement, by a sequencing. Information is reliant on structure. Information has certain kinds of semiotic systems that come into play. Data is a collection of facts, a collection of numbers, a collection of statistics, a collection of measurements. Data and information are not interchangeable, and it's critical to recognize the difference between the two within design, as in any other field. Putting that aside for the moment, the media has identified 3 infodemic forecasters: Joan Donovan, Claire Wardle, and Kate Starbird, who are identified as having been preparing for this moment for a decade, that everything in their careers has led up to the war on disinformation or the war on the infodemic. And I'm quoting Joan Donovan here, and by the way, Joan Donovan received her PhD in science studies here at UC San Diego. She's the director of the Technology and Social Change Research Project at the Shorenstein Center, Kennedy School, Harvard. And she was a Boston-based leader in the Occupy movement as a social media organizer. So Joan, Professor Donovan, says that the World Health Organization has declared that there are two crises going on. We have the pandemic, where the hospitals are being hit, but the infodemic is what the World Health Organization describes as the overabundance of information. Some accurate, some not. That abundance makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. So I'm going to take up this question of overabundance, this question of accuracy, and this question of trust as we move on. So overabundance of information is something that I would like to suggest that what we have is an abundance of data and an abundance of information, but these are two different things. And the problem resides in the relationship between those two things. So I want to kind of shift off of the identification of the problem. But again, here is the standard formation of the project that's been taken up, the World Health Organization formation of it being repeated here in Yale Medicine publication, where it's explained that the overabundance makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance, and that if people get the wrong information, we may have more trouble slowing the spread of the virus, which has proven to be true. But I want to suggest that the black and white thinking of wrong information, right information, too little information, too much information creates bigger problems, and I'll move on to that as we go. So the infodemic concept in some contexts relies on contagion as an analogy. So here we read in March 2020, the UN Department of Global Communications stating that we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. And this is the director of the World Health Organization at a gathering of foreign policy and security experts in Munich in mid-February, referring though to fake news that spreads more easily than this virus. So there's the long-standing use of medicalization, pathologization of information flows, viral information flows being one of those concepts that we're very familiar with. There is also the identification of a truth crisis, and for those of us in science studies, this recent article by Stephen Chapin from December issue of the LA Review of Books was very interesting because Stephen Chapin is perhaps regarded by many as the premier historian of truth in science, with his A Social History of Truth, Civility and Science in 19th Century England. And if you can take note of the book cover for a minute, you see a bunch of young guys, young European guys consulting with the Don, with the male figure who's the trusted source of knowledge. And A Social History of Truth, the book, relates the 17th century forward history of trust in a gentlemanly, quote unquote, context of recognizing authority and allegiance that is very much class-based and gender-based. And on the right, the Social History of Truth, as we move from one problematic graphic to another. This is a recent conference from last February in which we have Stephen Chapin's concept revived about 25 years after A Social History of Truth was published, to try and address what many of us are calling a crisis of truth. And Stephen Chapin's recent kind of op-ed piece for the LA Review of Books, this article, explains that, of course, there's a crisis of truth, and of course we live in a post-truth society. Truth denying is epidemic. So the truth crisis is again pathologized, even if the content of truth or information sharing is not medical. And interestingly, he also comments that Trump, Heidegger, Bruno Latour, Jacques Derrida, and Quentin Tarantino improbably share a sinful relativist bed. So we're seeing that the demise of relativism, the demise of trust in relativism, the painting in one brush of all relativism. And as somebody who's spent my whole career in science studies with feminist scientists who just repeatedly bring up this question of the value of relativism in cultural studies, this is a very difficult moment and a very troubling moment, because the pendulum swing back to truth holds, I believe, more problems than we are as yet willing to acknowledge. And I'll move toward that. Okay, so another crisis within this infodemic model is the trust crisis. And I have here as my kind of emblem the book by Ted Porter, Trust in Numbers, the classic also from the 90s about the pursuit of objectivity in science and public life. And again, quoting from Stephen Shapin, not from Ted Porter's book, Stephen Shapin's recent statement on data narratives, he says, with misinformation and data overabundance, we need to know whose opinion to take. We need to take seriously, we need to know who to take seriously about matters about which we happen to be ignorant. And that sort of knowledge, he explains, isn't technical. People might say that it isn't even scientific or even knowledge at all. So what he's saying is that he's saying, you know, I'm not a scientist, but I need to know who I can trust, whose opinion to take, and to take seriously, especially if I don't happen to be an expert. And I'm going to move towards suggesting that this poses a serious problem for design students and designers, because I think that when it comes to data science, designers actually need to know the science, and I'll move toward that, and not trust in numbers. So the numbers problem, which is at the core of my discussion, in his 1995 book, Porter's writing about our scientific culture, public life being based on trust in numbers. But in 2020, we have this incredible resurgence of prestige in quantitative methods, data, and objectivity that extends not just throughout the sciences and the medical sciences and public health, but also into news media, into humanities research practice, quantitative humanities. So how do numbers engender trust and mistrust becomes a major question. So if we're in a post-truth society, why is it that we suddenly have this enhanced trust in numbers? And the questions that come out of this is, what is not counted? What is counted? And I'm going to suggest that very few things are. Shockingly few things are. We have stunning data underabundance. And of course, who counts? Who does the counting? Who is counted? On the numbers problem of what is counted, what is modeled, these are excess deaths due to all causes during the first months of the COVID-19 epidemic. And the shaded areas are 95% prediction intervals. Reported deaths due to COVID-19 are indicated by dotted black lines. The blue lines with the dash, those are the volume of tests performed. And the black line is the excess deaths. Excess deaths means how many people died where it wasn't attributed to COVID-19, and was there a spike in those numbers of deaths suggesting uncounted COVID case deaths. So the 2020 COVID-19 state and nation-based comparative mortality and morbidity and transmission rates are the things that were counted. And so when it comes to COVID-19, we count mortality, we count morbidity, we count transmission rates, and to a certain extent, we try to count testing rates. And beyond that, the counting is, there are very few other categories in the collective basket of things being counted. And so Weinberger, Chen, and Cohen in the Journal of the American Medical Association recently published an article explaining their study that shows in the early part of the pandemic, when tests were in short supply, about 10 to 15% of all COVID infections were diagnosed. And in this cohort study, the number of deaths due to any cause increased by over 100,000 between March and the end of May, which is 28% higher than the reported number of COVID-19 deaths. So they're trying to pinpoint what is not counted, what gets missed. And there are many other ways in which to address this, which population demographics get missed, for example. And so here's the number problem of who counts. Coronavirus, it's from an article, Coronavirus Pandemic Threatens Accurate Census Count for Native American Tribes, NBC News mainstream article, in which it's explained that Vernon Livingston found his 2020 census pack strewn on the ground outside his home on the Navajo Nation, presuming it had blown away after someone dropped it off. He usually gets his mail from the post office. He filled out the form and sent it back. But if he had to do it online, he wouldn't have done it. And he can think of a lot of reasons why people are not getting counted in the census. So the kind of ricochet or trickle down effect, not getting counted and managed in a pandemic has direct ties to the economy, has direct ties to the census and multiple other areas. So enter data journalism as a way to move along with this quantitative turn. And in 2014, the New York Times launched a data journalism site called The Upshot, which is an interesting site for designers to follow. And it was set up to, quote, help people better understand big complex stories like inequality and the stock market. So data journalism, the Times explains, is not new. In a recent article, they explained, of course, it's not new. The vast amount of data available is what is new. So while the Times has, quote unquote, the best data experts, editors and graphics professionals, news reporters have to up their data skill level. And they need to do this, according to the Times and according to the journalists interviewed in this story, to find stories hidden in the numbers. So I want to run with this concept of stories hidden in numbers as an additional problem that comes from the trust in numbers ethos. And an example on the right from the New York Times Upshot site from this morning is the mail getting slower. We're tracking it. And so where is the mail slow? It's slow in the heartland. It's interestingly slow in Central California. What 28 million letters can tell us about how the post office is doing. So this is a big data tracking project that the New York Times is doing that is intervening in the defunding of the post office by the Trump administration. All right, so I want to suggest that this concept, infodemic, is fundamentally a narrative problem. Yes, it's a numbers problem, but numbers need and want narrative. And for that reason, doing data analysis, I'm arguing, arguably, requires narrative analysis. So this little graphic gives you a sense of many different ways of doing analysis: phenomenological analysis, grounded theory, network analysis. But what I want to suggest is that data analysis may seem to be the furthest thing from narrative analysis, but that data analysis and the move from data to information fundamentally requires narrative, and therefore, to do this responsibly, designers who work with data, which at this point is probably all designers, I believe need to really understand narrative analysis and narrative theory. So to set this up, I want to gesture to a book called What Do Pictures Want? The Lives and Loves of Images by W.J.T. Mitchell. Tom Mitchell's book is a major work in visual studies. It's about what he calls the pictorial turn. So he's a visual studies scholar like myself, and he is interested in the turn toward pictures and a picture-saturated, picture-rich society, such that we have things like the Getty and major archives of pictures where we pay for picture use, but also just free and rapid circulation of pictures. So I want to make a parallel here, or an analogy here. What do numbers want? Not just what do pictures want, but what do numbers want? And on the left, we have the things that Tom Mitchell tells us that pictures want. So some things that pictures have. Pictures have agency. Pictures influence us. Pictures have lives in which they perform meanings, and we engage with them and we're influenced. Pictures have desire. Pictures have surplus value, and they have often very high interpolative power. They hail us. So according to Mitchell, some things that pictures want: to be looked at, to have us enlist in their structural system, not necessarily their specific meanings, but to enlist in their systemic structural relationship with them, whether we accept their meanings or not, whether we engage interpolatively in a positive way or not. But most importantly, pictures want a story, not a specific story, but a narrative and discursive frame, or a set of narrative and discursive frames. And I want to suggest that numbers want this too, that numbers want a narrative and discursive frame. Some things that numbers and pictures don't want: containment and control. So numbers and pictures both resist containment and control because of their semiotic flexibility. So their lives and loves, to put it in Tom Mitchell's ironic formulation, their lives and loves are driven by their the multiplicity of their attachments. So pictures circulate, and as much as we would want them to say one thing and do one thing, they come to take on new and different meanings, as do numbers and as does data of different forms. And just to be clear, this idea of what do pictures want, the lives and loves of images, it's ironic, it's tongue-in-cheek, and it's trying to deal with taking away the idea that when we make meaning, that we are solely in control, and that our media forms and our media texts somehow live out the lives that we imagine for them. It's far from that truth. So I'm suggesting that the quantitative turn is also a narrative turn, and numbers, like pictures, demand a story. Some things they have, we've gone over those. Some things they want. The most important one we're going to focus on is a narrative and discursive frame. Numbers need and want a narrative and discursive frame to become information. And it's the it's information that the infodemic concept is formulated around, not data. Just to the side, I want to mention Laura Mulvey's well-known quip in her classic essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema: sadism demands a story. Sadism depends on making something happen, forcing a change in someone, a battle of will, victory, all occurring in linear time with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I want to suggest that we substitute pictures. Pictures demand a story, and also numbers demand a story. Numbers depend on making something happen. Numbers force a change. Numbers enter into and also engender battles of will and strength, victory and defeat, all occurring in narrative time. So this has important implications for design professionals and design students, because design assumes a structuring role in giving numbers the narrative life that they demand, and in order to become information. So here, a further quote from the New York Times, one of the New York Times articles about their push to data journalism. They interviewed Eliza Shapiro, where she wrote a little piece for a series of little articles by data journalists about their work in the data training workshops that the New York Times has been running for a couple of years now. So Eliza Shapiro was a journalist who wants to research admissions ratios across New York City high schools after noticing that Stuyvesant admitted like maybe 7 African-American and Latinx students one year, which was a number that she knew to be far lower than, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So Eliza Shapiro writes, with my colleague, KK Rebecca Lai from the Times Graphics Department, I started to dig into a spreadsheet that listed the racial breakdown of each of the specialized schools dating to the mid-70s. So they took the focus on Stuyvesant, a very high level high school of science and math, and mushroomed this study to make it about all of the specialized schools in New York, all the way back to the 70s, so it became a 50-year study. And they quickly realized, so they were able to do their data analysis quickly, that the schools had lost nearly all their Black and Hispanic students over the last decade. So what I want to emphasize here is that this is Eliza Shapiro, the journalist, working with a graphics department employee at the Times. And so there's this kind of merger happening, not between photography and journalism, but between information, data, graphics, and journalism. Because to work with graphics at this point requires knowledge about data systems, data archiving, and journalists aren't trained in this. So journalists are highly dependent on designers, ultimately, who assume a structuring role in giving numbers and stories their life. Okay, so moving back to the World Health Organization, I showed you a definition of infodemic from Wikipedia, Wiktionary at the top of this presentation. And I want to point out that although it's no longer in the Wiktionary page, if you look in the history, you'll see that the source for this definition piece is the World Health Organization. And if infodemic is an excessive amount of information concerning a problem, such that the solution is made more difficult. And I want to talk about this idea that too much information makes solutions difficult. So the implication here is that it is not the real world problem that makes solutions difficult. It's not the complexity of the economy, of bias, of discrimination, of resource allocation. These are not the things that make solutions difficult. It's too much information that makes things difficult. And I find this a jaw-droppingly shocking display of control tactics by the World Health Organization, because they are essentially at war with numbers over narrative control. So what do numbers want? Numbers want a narrative. Numbers want to be invested with the structuring apparatus of information narrative. And the World Health Organization does not want that step to be taken with big data, because it makes quote, makes the solution more difficult, meaning that the display of complexity as a big data complexity as information in a narrative form sometimes works against their solutions. And while perhaps a decade ago I might have hoped that the World Health Organization solutions would be mine too, or that the CDC's would be mine too, and I'm thinking back to 2012, participating with the World Health Organization and the CDC at a conference on H1N1 after the epidemic was over, after the outbreak was over in 2012, 2013 in Hong Kong, and feeling like they had done a reasonable job, but now knowing that it is this idea that the solution is made more difficult by information. This is a fundamentally dangerous formulation for a World Health Organization to make. And I want to gesture to the book on the right and Richard's, the big data agenda, data ethics and critical data studies, just to indicate a whole field that is super critical for designers doing work around data to understand the ethics and the critical approach to data is fundamental for designers. All right, so the Two Epidemics Model associated with the 2020 pandemic is in fact something that emerged in 2003 around the former SARS outbreak. When in 2003 there was a SARS outbreak, David Rothkopf of the Washington Post wrote, "SARS is the story of not one epidemic but two." And the second epidemic, the one that has escaped the headlines, has implications far greater than the disease itself. That is because it is not the viral epidemic, but rather an information epidemic that has transformed SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome, from a bungled Chinese regional health crisis into a global economic and social debacle. The infodemic has made the public health crisis, and here we have it, harder to control and contain. So bundled into this statement from 17 years ago by David Rothkopf, we have the whole logic of the anti-infodemic that is being promulgated now. And it's the idea that this is not one epidemic, but two, and that the implications are far greater with the info epidemic than with the medical epidemic. The info epidemic in some ways is worse than the viral epidemic, and it's because, it's not that it's worse than, it's because it constitutes the viral epidemic. So this moves beyond analogy, this moves beyond the contagion analogy of viral information being as if like a virus, information being contagious as if. This is about information constituting an epidemic, producing epidemic conditions, and furthering epidemic to pandemic conditions, which in turn constitute economic crisis. So information has escalated from analogy to a structuring force, a constitutive force, not only for public health, but also for the economy. And that was in 2003, so that was 17 years ago. So some take-home points here in the middle. The infodemic culture raises the stakes on design practice. The structurally constitutive nature of information makes the work of the information designer more consequential than ever before in history. And this is true not only for public health, but also for every other section of the economy, every other sector, the economy, health, welfare. Second point, infodemic culture raises the stakes on data science for designers, and I want to make the argument that knowing whose opinion to take is not good enough. Knowing which data sources you're going to use because you trust their politics or somebody told you they're quote unquote reliable is a little bit like saying, I'm only going for quality and so I'm going to shop at Whole Foods. I find Stephen Chapin's argument about knowing who to trust a lot like the 17th century culture of gentlemanly collegiality. So I know where to buy my clothes. I know where to buy my food because I like quote unquote quality. There are certain kind of class and economic and knowledge structures in place there that designers should really be aware of and work against. So designers working with numbers need to understand the data science and at the same time maintain research-based skepticism about data truth. If you're designing something, you don't need to believe your data. You need to have a handle on the structural system through which your data is speaking and the structural system through which your data was generated. To get a handle on truth, then we must know data science. And that's because the structurally constitutive nature of quantitative accounts makes data science knowledge highly consequential for designers. And then the third point, infodemic culture raises the stakes on narrative fiction, practice, and theory. Skill in narrative and story becomes far more consequential, not less consequential with the quantitative term. So one might think in a kind of, everyday logical way, the turn to numbers, the turn away from words to numbers, the turn away from pictures to numbers should probably be a turn away from narrative, because narrative is qualitative. Narrative is about pictures, movies, words, stories, not numbers. But the turn to the quantitative escalates the stakes of narrative. The New York Times trust in numbers is a kind of magical thinking, that our news reporters want to find stories hidden in numbers is magical thinking, that there are stories hidden in numbers. Numbers do not hold stories. Numbers want stories in order to get a life. They are parasitic on stories. But stories are never just hidden in numbers waiting to be told. Numbers are waiting to be given the structure of a story. Designers working with numbers need to know this, know narrative systems, and understand fiction logics in order to shape data into information responsibly. Okay, so an example here of the World Health Organization's epidemiological construction of stories and numbers in their modality of resisting complexity. Remember, the World Health Organization hates overabundance. So this is the SARS outbreak of 2003, in which I think like 8,000 cases only. There's a relatively small outbreak. It's modelable in this tight, spare form. There is a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, there's closure. And here we have on the left the account that goes with this graphic. Today, the World Health Organization is removing Taiwan from the list of areas with recent local transmission of SARS. Taiwan is the last to be removed. It has been 20 days since the last case. So the World Health Organization is claiming mastery over a narrative which had a beginning, a dramatic ascent, a climax, and then an ascent to closure. And the World Health Organization authors the data into a narrative of success. And here you have the simple narrative arc template, just demonstrating to you the way in which the World Health Organization uses spare numbers and spare graphics to suggest closure, control, and mastery over a World Health event. So the World Health Organization is fighting SARS-CoV-2, our current COVID-19 pandemic, but also an overabundance of information. How is this playing out? In order to understand that, we need to look back and see how other outbreaks and pandemics were played out graphically through data usage by these organizations. So in 2005, David Nabarro, who was just appointed the senior UN systems coordinator for avian and human flu, warned that an outbreak of avian flu could kill 5 to 150 million people. And the UN World Tourism Organization immediately responded, you know, panicking is going to endanger the whole travel industry. We must ensure that people are not deterred from travel. So this was characterized as an infodemic in 2005 of speculative reports. The term speculative in the health communication context is tainted by the brush of drama and the drush of narrative histrionics and exacerbation. So we see the emergence after that period of real-time crisis forecasting and predictive modeling. On the top, we have the Epidemic Prediction Initiative that the Health and Human Services US government agency launched. And on the bottom, the CDC's government epidemic prediction initiatives, COVID-19 forecasting, W90 forecasting challenge. So real-time crisis forecasting versus speculative, quote unquote, speculative reports, and then everything in between. So I'm comparing here the real-time crisis modeling on the bottom of COVID-19 from the COVID-19 dashboard by the Center for System Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins. This was from yesterday at 2:01, actually 12:01 Eastern Standard Time. So the top graphic, the World Health Organization SARS 2003 graphic, is indicative of narrative closure. The one on the right is indicative of a cliffhanger. And here's the cliff in the off-screen space where you have an infodemic logic of overabundance of symbolic information, systems and codes, and spare data types. All the information that you're getting here is within 3 categories: morbidity, mortality, and testing. So although you have it given to you in many different forms, with numbers crunched in many different ways, it is not overabundance. It is underabundance. Morbidity, mortality, testing, that's underabundance. There aren't many things being tested. Transmission, but not on this site. So the infodemic logic stresses the quote-unquote problem of overabundance of data, but on the other hand, severely delimits data types. And I want to go back to this graphic on the lower right. So crisis modeling needs messy speculative narrative systems. I'm proposing not just data analytics, forecasting to capture complexity and unpredictability. So narrative provides an arrangement or sequence. Information is essentially an arrangement or sequence of data. So information needs narrative, narrative needs information. These are interlocking concepts. To arrive at the way to generate the remainder of this as time goes on is not just a matter of getting the data right, or if we're going to do predictive data modeling to get the numbers right to predict, but also to take into account the broader range of things that come into play with speculative narrative thinking. And some of those things include contingency, catastrophe, and action, varieties of action that predictive analytics cannot keep up with. AI data is essentially data analytics, cannot keep up with complexity, and the idea that someday it will is, I believe, the carrot or the holy grail, depending on which way you want to talk about it. The other problem that I think speculative narrative systems thinking is particularly helpful for is modeling public health communication. And it's because you need skill in narrative structuring of data to convey and control complexity and uncertainty, and to understand to what extent you are controlling to the point of manipulating. And that's something that narrative theory is very richly structured to do, to allow us to understand voice, to allow us to understand intentionality, agency. Narrative theory provides this, data analytics doesn't. The emotional impact of numbers, nuances of engendering, managing hope, managing dread. These are things that speculative narrative systems theories and methods can do, but data analytics is not prepared to do. Okay. In 2003, the SARS epidemiological numbers were essentially, as I've mentioned, a control narrative, where rendering them in simplicity brings emotional closure, social containment, and a sense that the World Health Organization authored and led this particular event. It's a closed event. Avoiding overabundance of information allowed for the cleanness and clarity of this image, which puts the World Health Organization in a leading position. We can look to other graphics of the period. These are narrative arcs. On the left, a narrative arc concerning a peanut butter salmonella outbreak in 2008, 2009. Again, we have the CDC here with this kind of narrative closure. And an epidemic curve of confirmed H7 and 9 World Health Organization as a series of closed events, like serialized narratives. But there are other viruses that are underabundant in the data surrounding them or constituting them. Overabundance is strategically overplayed around certain viruses, while other viruses go with woefully little investment in generating data. So hepatitis B and C are together the 7th leading cause of death worldwide, killing 1.5 million people a year, more than either HIV or tuberculosis, and yet most of the 400 million people who have chronic hepatitis B and C, which are the most serious forms of the viral hepatitis alphabet, they don't know they're infected. So you would think that there would be investment in data generation, but there's not. This is one of the most underobserved and underestimated viral pandemics in existence. And the research funding and data generation around it is shockingly minimal, especially as compared to HIV. So on the left, you see a chart showing the rise of numbers of hepatitis C related deaths and the declines in other nationally notifiable infectious conditions. This is, of course, pre-COVID. This is up until 2013. Okay, so this is the Pandemic Severity Index, and I want to show what happens with its narrative leanings. This is the old one that was in use until 2014. This gives you a better sense. So characteristics: fatality ratio, excess death ratio, illness rate, potential number of deaths, 20th century US experience. So the severity index here, where you see the 1918 pandemic, a category 5 on the right, and you're probably thinking category 5 sounds like a hurricane, and you're right. So the pandemic severity index was modeled on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale and introduced a problem. A single metric doesn't always accurately predict impact. So the single metrics of mortality and morbidity that circulate with COVID-19 don't always accurately predict impact, clearly. In the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, early reports suggested an elevated case fatality rate, and people were taking that number and multiplying it 30 times 30% of the population, coming up with horrendous death tolls. And this happened at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which happened to move in the other direction from H1N1 and outstrip many of those projections. So just as there can be a huge difference in damage between the same hurricane hitting Miami versus New Orleans, the same virus and the numbers associated with its single metric can end up with vastly different outcomes. And so the scale itself is problematic, resulting in the altering of the scale, the introduction of softened wave transitions rather than walls, a gradation rather than hard differences in color, pandemic preparedness preparing scenarios that are pre-pandemic preparedness scenarios, and underscoring the importance of broad and flexible planning. So the future is introduced, essentially. From 2017 on, the future gets introduced to the disaster scale, the severity scale. And here, again, another version, the CDC Influenza Risk Assessment Tool, IRAT, which is used in the pre-pandemic phase to do prediction. And you can see it's gradated. It's also in a quadrant form. I'm not gonna talk about that. And TIPRA, the WHO's Pandemic Influenza Severity Assessment Guidance graphic. TIPRA is a gradient rather than, doesn't even give us waves or bands. It's graduated to a gradient and with points within the gradient. All right, so we have a truth problem in infodemic modeling, where this is the model at play among critics of infodemics as a concept, as a cultural phenomenon. And I'm not in favor of infodemic as a concept, but I find problems with this modeling of it, that there's truth, and then there's misinformation, there's disinformation, but then outside that box, there's no information. How do I take this up within design fiction? Well, there's a truth problem here. If what is at stake is modeling and understanding and predicting a pandemic's impacts, of what use is fiction. And this is a synchronic spatial model that gives us a blurry area between nonfiction and fiction. But to make this useful, I want to suggest that we shift from design fiction to design narrative, because narrative provides a spatial construction concerned with form, foregrounds, narrative device over narrative events, and attention to negative space, what's outside the box of the graphic, and also that we make the synchronic Venn diagram spatialized and flip it and make it also diachronic, introducing a time scale at the bottom from historical time to speculative time. So what this allows is for any moment in time to engage vertically with fiction and nonfiction, not just by hitting that center, but by crossing through both and drawing on both modalities in working in design narrative. And why would we do this? Not to introduce misinformation or disinformation, but to recognize that information is fundamentally always drawing on both fiction and nonfiction. And this happens in the area of the now, especially. And I'm sort of jokingly suggesting that this area of the now in the center, that sort of gray squiggly area, is the infodemic as quantum entanglement, Einstein's spooky action at a distance, in which particles communicate and co-adopt multiple values together. So the blur between nonfiction and fiction, or the interaction, is engaged communication that can be tracked and mapped and structured. For example, in stochastic modeling. So the space of speculative narrative is activated not by a generalized fiction, but by constraints and conventions adopted from the historical field of action. And I'm going to shift here to my last example, which is one that Benjamin Bratton introduced last week, an unresolved mapping of speculative design, in which we see speculative design as a rather large circle that encompasses critical design, design fiction, design futures. And Benjamin noted in introducing the scale, this diagram, scale is not indicative of significance. You see that note on the lower left. And I want to make a little joke about this. Scale is not indicative of significance. Here we have numbers of spec design, as in specialization in design, cognitive science minors, upwards of 400, and the 70 or so speculative design majors. So scale matters, and it's something that is being tongue-in-cheek raised here as an issue, that scale is political in the Venn diagram, by Elliot Montgomery, who's on the left here. He's the designer of this particular scale. He's half of the Extrapolation Factory. And the Extrapolation Factory produced this operator's manual, and alternative unknown methods is one of the methods in the manual, offering a way to set up live action simulators to serve as design prototyping tools, allowing designers to investigate and test system level challenges, drawing upon scenario simulations devised by emergency management groups. So they're seizing on military and emergency management systems to stage improvised actions that they're calling pre-actions with as simulations in groups starting with a script and starting with a designed object and starting with certain props in a fixed space. So here you see from the exhibition Alternative Unknowns, organized by Montgomery and his partner, an emergency simulator pre-enactment where the group is given a script, they're given a space, they're given a design object, and they're given some props. And they're going to pre-enact several alternative scenarios that are made possible by this set of materials. So I want to suggest that this is very much about historical flash forward, and that without the historical backstory of the narrative, you don't have the simulation's improvisational content. The script as well provides historical backstory. And that pre-action is essentially a fast forward into crisis, into the space of crisis in the future that comes from the past. And that this is essentially something that is, I feel, important to model through narrative theory, which is very simplistically presented here. So pre-action is improvised pre-enactment, which takes the place of story. And it's narrative on your feet. It's narrative time is crisis time. And it's essentially a speculative narrative pre-action, which encapsulates diachronic time, situates action in the abstract time of fictional narrative, facilitates repetition for comparative outcomes analysis, and allows us to get past what Sam Hart has modeled here as the kind of quarantine wall that keeps us from walking into alternative unknowns. Okay, so I've hit the hour mark, and I'm going to move from here to the workshop portion, but I think that what I'll do is end my PowerPoint briefly so that I can take questions and answers before we move into the workshop. Stephanie, what's our next step here?
Questions sound good if people have them.
I had a question. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that space between fiction and nonfiction, because it didn't have like a term. I wanted to know if you have thought about that in like a term form.
Yeah, so I introduced the quantum complexity concept as just a kind of metaphor to suggest that this is not so much about, so people speak a lot about entanglement. There's entanglement, there's messiness, there's complexity, but it's not enough to say that the space of the now, which entails bringing in story as in fictional modeled story, bringing in facts, take story, take fact, what's fake, how much can you bend it, what's journalistically reasonable, what's reasonable for the designer to do before the meaning is changed, rather than seeing it as open and flexible, which of course it is. How do we pick apart that complexity to understand its constitutive elements and to understand the exact ways in which fiction and nonfiction paradigms work together? And it's narrative theory that provides a way to understand the way that fiction and nonfiction come together in forms like journalism, in forms like data design, information design. So rather than saying, oh, it's complex, or, oh, fiction lets me imagine the future. Well, your imagination is the product of 12 movies. And so I don't mean that disparagingly, so is mine. So improvisation is my idea of what improvisation is from having seen other people improvise. So how do we begin to understand the relationship between improvisation and script, narrative fiction and non-narrative fiction? nonfiction narrative and fiction narrative. Requires really understanding how those particles are communicating as opposed to saying it's complex. Does that, Caleb, does that answer?
Yeah, it got me.
Thoughts for you?
It does. It kind of got me thinking a little more about all of that. Like, I think you can see in satire that kind of crossover between fiction and truth. And then, like you're saying, we're all kind of this product of the 12 movies. So I think that's kind of a common thread that people share. So even like fantasy has those interactions and things are things that we mimic, or we've seen and we learn from and we do a twist on it. But like, I don't know, I was just like, oh, that's kind of, there is a lot of correlation and there's a lot of space in there.
The example of fantasy is great because fantasy is very much reliant on historical reference points. So when you have fictional fantasy, sci-fi fantasy, speculative fiction, there's often a reference to historical events. And so the crossover back into nonfiction is embedded in the fiction text. So that area of complexity, I feel, requires narrative theory to understand the inter-embeddedness at different moments of fiction within nonfiction, within fiction, within nonfiction, as opposed to I am working in a fiction mode.
Yeah, final comment. I just thought of also like metaphor could be used that way, where it's a complete, what the words are saying is completely fictional, but the message is nonfiction. Anyways, that really helped clarify. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for the question, Caleb.
I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay.
Hi, Gabi, sure.
So this is great. I really, really love this. And at the sort of midpoint takeaway, you said, if you're designing something, you don't need to believe in your data. You need to have a handle on the structural system in which your data is speaking.
Yeah.
And then you kind of suggested that the way that might happen for the designer is educating the designer in data science or in how data science works. And I'm wondering, institutionally speaking, right, like practically speaking, where does that happen within the institution? Is it the role of a speculative design department? Is it the role of design department? Is it the role of data, right? Where physically can that, do you think, happen within sort of the institution?
Yeah, I think so. There are two pieces to this, and one is the requirement that I'm saying you need to know data science, but you also need to know narrative. And so this thinking is coming out of the Cog-Sci minor, Viz Arts major split, which you know all too well, and so do Jonah and Stephanie. And so on the one hand, you have the social science model, which gives you the information science within cognitive science that emerges out of some of the same paradigms as info science. On the other side, you have visual arts, which is linked to the humanities in our institution, at least, with art history being embedded there, and gives you narrative theory, which in my view, structural narrative theory should be brought to bear with information science for this to happen for the designer. And so it would require input from both sides. And of course, I have a foot in both. I'm in the social sciences, I'm in science studies and communication, I'm in visual arts. So I really want to see this connection happen in the pedagogy, so that students aren't just assuming I'm making a fiction and not realizing the historical rootedness of the metaphors and as Caleb was pointing out, or the paradigms or the reference points within that fiction. On the other hand, I'm just working with data, not understanding the narrative that informs their data is not given, is not objective. So bringing those two together.
Thank you so much.
And then Gabi, you can show us how you're doing it at York.
Yeah.
When you put this forward at York.
I'll let you know in a few decades. That sounds great.
I have a question. Thank you for this really thought-provoking presentation. It made me think a lot about different research projects that I have. But I was really interested in your nod to the upshot. This is the New York Times, and it's their attempt to use data analytics to tell certain stories. And this is Emily Badger is in charge of this. And Emily has called me and asked about, different projects that she's worked on, and they have a really interesting process because, she came to me and she had all of these maps, and they were trying to study gentrification around the country, and they had mapped all of these neighborhoods in cities all over the U.S. that had changed from being predominantly Black to whiter over time. And she said, could I show you these maps and can you interpret them for me? And because they didn't know how to read these maps. They didn't know what was going on in these cities because they don't have the substantive knowledge about all of these different cities. And, it really got me thinking, who gets, there are these data scientists who are doing all of this work, but they don't know sort of the deep substantive, topics, right? But then they're reaching out to these experts, and then, she called me, and then she said, who else should I talk to? And I said, oh, you should talk to Dan Immergluck at Georgia Tech. And, I gave her all these names. And then she pieced together this story about the data. And, it raises this question of, who gets to shape the narrative, who gets to tell the story, and what is the truth, right? And this also, I think, speaks to the 1619 project, if you followed that project from the New York Times, and how the journalist, her name is, I think, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and she, created this project, and then these very prominent historians came out to actually challenge her on this project. And they didn't necessarily challenge her on the history. They challenged her on how she told the story and the message and the narrative around slavery.
That's great. It's great.
And so I guess, I don't know if this is a question, but it just really got me thinking about these issues of whose truth are we telling and who gets to tell the story.
Yeah, your story about that project really gets to the core of what I'm trying to unpack here. And it's interesting that you're raising historians. I'm putting forward narrative as a narrative analysis out of a modality of literary history and the writing of history and fiction paradigm. And it's interesting that historians were the ones to step forward, not to question the data so much as the form. Is that where how things went? I didn't follow that aspect of it.
They thought she was too pessimistic about progress that we've made in terms of racial progress. So it was really interesting in terms of, they seemed to kind of, well, this is my interpretation, but sort of believe in Martin Luther King's there's a arc towards justice, right? So they believe that we're moving closer towards justice, whereas her interpretation was, no, we aren't, that we're actually moving farther away. So it was an interpretation and the story she was telling that they had problems with.
So interesting, especially for this group where the focus is on design, and there's always that question, what is the responsibility of the designer on the project to kind of moving along a particular interpretation, shading it, so to speak, in one direction or another. To what extent does the designer take that initiative? Interesting. Thanks for the comment. I will look into that further. Wonderful example.
I have to pop off, but thank you so much for this.
Great to see you. Thank you for being here. Bye.
Hi, Lisa. Great talk. Hey. And so kind of following on from Gabi's questions, I was wondering if if algorithmic literacy it's a term you didn't mention, but if that's something that you're kind of thinking about it in this space between the designer understanding the data science and being able to interpret it and give the data the appropriate narrative. Because I think, like when I was a kid, media literacy was the thing. How do you understand what what is the intent of the writer? And you had to learn all of these things as critical thinking skills. And, perhaps when other people were growing up, that was still there, or it wasn't, you never know. But that has sort of become, as some of these issues with algorithmic bias and particularly AI and the bias of training sets has emerged, that has become like this critical nexus between the data science and the media literacy. So I was just wondering if that's something that you're kind of thinking about, or is that like maybe a little bit off of where your focus is?
Maybe it's right on target. It really is. It's right on target. I would introduce the word critical literacy in there because, so for example, Jonathan Cohn, C-O-H-N, professor at University of Alberta, he is a media scholar who looks at algorithmic knowledge systems and their cultural leanings and the ways in which ideology is invested into the algorithm. So I would insert the term critical literacy in there, and that would definitely be right along the track of what I'm trying to describe here for sure.
Okay.
Anybody else before we move on to workshop phase? Stephanie, what do you think? Are we ready for workshop?
That sounds good.
Okay, so anybody who wants to stick around for the workshop, I'm going to relaunch my PowerPoint and move into the workshop phase. So I ended with this little graphic by Sam Hart from Fog of War 2015, which predates our current era of quarantine, in which he is talking about modeling futures which operate at an unfamiliar scale. And there's a certain kind of interesting problem with this graphic because it's partially a map. It is one in which time moves forward from left to right. And so it's a chart, but it's also a map. It's a spatialized chart. And you can pass through the quarantine wall. It's dotted. But is alternative unknowns a vertical door? Is alternative unknowns a demarcated space on the floor? It's got an ambiguous kind of duck. What's the other one that comes with the duck in the double Wittgenstein image? Somebody remind me, when you have an image of a duck and duck rabbit. It's like a duck rabbit. Is it a door or is it a space on the floor where one stands that's got walls and boundary? So it's a way of raising ambiguities of space in a graphic that allows for particular narrative engagements, futures which operate at unfamiliar or ambiguous scales. And of course, if you're familiar with these, you know that he's kind of gesturing to these situationist maps. On the left, we have the psychogeographic plan of appearance, reconfiguring the standard planimetric map from Guy Debord and Oscar Jorn's The Naked City, 1957. And on the right, a map of the 16th arrondissement of Paris, tracing the routes taken by a student over the course of a year as she went to her class and to her piano lessons. And you can see that she went over and over and over, and you get this kind of clot in the middle. So it's a bit of a joke on a map. And the workshop is going to build off of these situationist maps. So the background is that in 1957, Guy Debord and others founded the Situationist International, which was a group of artists, intellectuals, and political theorists who study the experience of life in media-intensive mid-century capitalism. They blurred the distinction between art and life, calling for constant transformation of lived experience through staged and spontaneous action. Debord was initially associated with lettrism, which was a French artistic movement of the 40s, and he introduced psychogeography, this kind of mapping, which was a hybrid approach that emphasized human feeling and action in the spatialized context of geographic mapping. And he and his colleagues made counter maps of the city that challenged the centralized institutional logic of the Le Corbusier plan of post-war Paris. So Debord said, from a Derivé point of view, cities have psychogeographical contours. They have constant currents, they have fixed points, they have vortexes that discourage entry or exit from certain zones. And to map territories conducive to swerve, situationists had to devise a form to capture the psychological and social, as well as spatial layout of the city. So they're trying to capture the feel of space that is consonant with movement through space. So the workshop is pretty simple. It is fall 2020, and the CDC just announced that there will be no vaccine until mid to late 2021. This is real. This just happened this morning. The CDC announced there's not going to be a vaccine until mid to late 2021. So you decided it's time. You've downloaded a coronavirus contact tracer and tracker app. And now you are going to map your route from home to a routine destination and back each day for a week. So you're going to have 5 passes, following the model of the map of the 16th arrondissement of Paris, tracing the routes taken by the student as she went to school and piano lessons over the course of a year. Your route must vary, however, according to the pings you get on your phone to avoid cases of COVID-19 that you're notified about. So your map is going to be determined, it's a pre-action, it's a simulation, it's a pre-action, and it's going to be a mapping of routes that are avoidant routes. You're also going to make a line or a bar chart showing the number of contact points you are notified about each day. So it's just 2 very quick sketches that I'm asking you to do. To speculatively chart your transit pre-action as a narrative course of avoidance over 1 week, 5 journeys back and forth, taking into account the contact notices that you get and creating a data narrative showing contact pings per trip. So if you could just quickly make those sketches and prepare to share them with us, whether you do it on a piece of paper, whether you open up, some computer program that you like to draw in, and share, at least let's do the first one because we're a little bit short on time. At least just do the mapping. Any questions?
What map do we draw to use? The French one?
You're making a map of your own neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
Which you are mapping walking from your house or traveling from your house, wherever you live, to a destination that you frequent back and forth 5 times.
Okay.
But you have with you your phone with the app that's going to ping you, and you will have to take avoidant routes. So you have to generate through pre-action, you have to generate for yourself a narrative of pings and locations for those pings, which should get you to start thinking about what locations in my neighborhood are COVID-19 hotspots. What would I do if I learned that I was in a spot where there was someone with COVID-19? I have to sneeze, hold on. What would you do? Would you just ignore it and pass through anyway? Would you be avoidant? So this is a pre-action simulation that helps you to pre-think avoidant behavior during the coming phase when we will be burdened with the affordance of being able to identify people around us with COVID-19, which is going to be a topic that Camille Nebeker will be talking about next week. She'll be talking about COVID-19 trackers. Any questions? So you're making a map, essentially. So let's take about 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll reconvene and look at each other's maps and talk about them. Sound okay, Stephanie? Yona?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. I was just like thinking, you know, because of COVID, a lot of us are like staying at home and not even like going out. So those pings on our map, like for me, like my like frequent destination would be Sprouts, and you know, really avoidance of like going another way if I was pinged with this tracker.
You would not, you're saying?
Right. Yeah. Nope.
Yeah,
Because
so,
it's like one straight line.
yeah, so back and forth, and then you would be pre-actively trying to assess where those pings will come from.
Right.
This is going to be fun. I was going to do the same exact thing, and I also live in a straight line from Sprouts. So either you live in this building, or we, yeah. And if we both get COVID, that, yeah, and then I was thinking if Sprouts appears at COVID, that, you know, right? It's more likely. So, yeah.
Then we're avoiding it. Now we're trying to like get the delivery to the house.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you can also map Sprouts for that matter.
Oh,
Yeah.
around the grocery store.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's really interesting because there was a community outbreak at a grocery store, but they'll tell us that there was a community outbreak, but they won't tell us which grocery store. And so I think by having this ping, we would have more information about whether to avoid the grocery store.
Wow, that's so interesting. They wouldn't tell you which grocery store. But
No, they don't tell us what restaurants are involved with community spread. So you get to know what kind of business is at the hub of a community spread, but that's all they reveal. So we really never know.
Yeah, that's what the county does. Yeah. So in some cases, the grocery store, at least they used to, they would reveal it. But now what the county does is they will only say the type of business, and yeah, it's very.
Yeah, so I think with having a device, I'm just thinking about the
Yeah.
motivation, because I'm less likely to have a digital tracking tool that I use. But I think, you know, if it were to help me not know, or to know that I was heading into a dangerous hub. I mean, I'm like you guys, the only outings I do is just walking around the neighborhood. You know, I would just turn left instead of right.
yeah, it's interesting because that creates these, what Debord and his associates called autonomous zones, where certain zones become marked zones, certain zones become taboo, certain zones become off limits and stigmatized. It's interesting. So the people who get the pings know what store it was, right? Camille?
Camille, you're on mute. We can't hear anything you're saying.
You wouldn't get a ping necessarily in advance. You might be told after the fact that you were in a location where there was a spread.
Ah, okay.
And that would then encourage you to get tested, similar to what just happened with the UCSD wastewater. where they were able to test wastewater and identify COVID in the wastewater, and then told people that were in that area on these days that they need to get tested. And from this, I think it was 600 tests that they did, there were 2 positive. So
Really?
then identify those 2 people and move into an isolation phase for those 2 people. It's going to be, we're going to have a really interesting conversation next week where we're talking, building off of what you're doing, Lisa, and really kind of diving into all of these different surveillance pathways.
I didn't realize that the notification was after the fact and was really just about testing and not about avoidance. I hadn't realized that about the contact tracers.
Yeah, they're not telling us where these things happen. They only say you were in an area where something did happen.
Yeah,
So you could probably figure it out
that's
yourself.
true.
You could figure it out yourself. If your path is to Sprouts and back, you're going to know pretty certain that that's where you may have been. But if you're in around a lot of different people, you may not. And so in order to protect confidentiality, they're not revealing exactly who it was or where it was. And that's to protect businesses from being stigmatized, obviously. So
interesting. Does anybody have a drawing ready that you'd like to share? I'm going to stop my share. And let's start sharing some drawings.
I can share mine.
Fantastic. Go for it, Caleb.
Okay. So the black line is the street. This is the starting point. This is the ending point. So this is one of the major turning points, like right here. It's one of my outlets that I could take 2 options. And then here's another one where I could go to the right or straight. And then right off the bat, I can turn here and go that way. So I was able to get 5, but I don't think I could get more.
Where are the places that you're avoiding?
I just avoided taking any of the same streets, like doing like a variation in streets, I guess.
Oh, so you're trying to, by varying your path, you're trying to minimize repeat exposure.
Yeah, like I have 5 different ways to get there if I'm walking. I don't know. Because then say the like gas station has an outbreak, then I don't want to go by that or whatever, if they let us know before. But yeah, I'll stop sharing. That was it.
I really like the use of color on yours. What was your destination?
The taco shop.
Great. Any comments for Caleb? No comments.
Saying there's no outbreak at the taco shop.
Yeah.
I'm jealous that you have colored pens like right there, ready to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
did like I made like the most boring one possible. Oh, not really focusing real well, is it? Doesn't like that. It's so boring the camera won't focus. Come on. No,
take it out of the frame for a second and let the camera focus on you. There you go. Oh, but we can't see the image.
You can't see the image.
We could at first.
Yeah, let me hold on. If I can pull up with the other hand the software that can adjust the camera. Otherwise, I'll just, if it doesn't work, I'll just describe it to you. Let's see. Oops.
There it is. There it is. There it is. We can see it. Very good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. First day, I go straight to Sprouts. Second day, so yeah, then there's an outbreak, and so I like go south and I go back, and then there's an outbreak on that street. I wouldn't really do this though, because I'd just be walking past these houses, and I wouldn't really think I was going to get COVID from just like a house or something. But yeah, then just sort of like making, fiction. And then I go, so all right, then I go like the other way to Sprouts. Then the fourth day, there's an outbreak that's obviously at Sprouts. And so I either just give up, I'd probably just give up and go along Route 1 at this point, because I still need to go to Sprouts. So I'm like, the heck of it, I'll just go straight there. And then, but then the fifth day, it's like there's an outbreak in my building. And so then I'm very responsible and I just stay home.
Huh. Okay.
So it eventually, yeah, either way, it eventually ends up, I can't go anywhere. It's very, it's supposed to be nihilistic, actually. And, yes.
A sad narrative.
A sad narrative, yes. Of not going to Sprouts.
Isolation gets worse.
Yes, it's the COVID is everywhere, and well, one reason that I was thinking this is because there's a lot of questions about how the contract tracing is working. Like in one article I was reading that if two cars pass each other and they both have their windows up, that's going to generate a ping. So you weren't really exposed; you just drove by somebody with your windows up.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. The question I'm having is, are we going to just have so many positives and false positives that it becomes meaningless? So that's actually kind of what I was thinking when I was like, yeah, and then eventually I just keep going to Sprouts, and then finally it's in my building anyway.
Yeah, it's the reason I did this was to get at the point that the data that we're seeking is so limited that it's really underabundance. What are we seeking? Where is the person who has this?
Yeah.
And that it leads down this narrative path, even though it's a very constricted piece of data or pool of data.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, we have this very quantitative, like very gross data, right? Oh, somebody was there that had COVID, but you don't know anything about, were they there for 2 seconds? Did you pass them with your car windows up? Were you both wearing masks? Were you outdoors? So it's really, I question whether we're going to get useful data or are we?
Yeah, or will epidemiology up its information and narrative skills and help us to interpret the data with more specificity?
Exactly.
Yeah. Camille is saying validity and reliability is a really important concern which will influence trust and buy-in. Yeah, it sounds like you've got a skeptic in Amy though, Camille. So anybody else have a picture that they'd like to share? Nobody? Oh, I know somebody else had to do it.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, it's hard to see.
Jonah, go for it.
Oh,
Jess is showing hers.
I did two different ones. I did the one just driving back and forth, like nothing, I'm unfazed right here. A little car going back and forth from the house to Sprouts and the coffee shop. And then I did like a different scenario here, whereas if someone at the coffee shop ended up, or there was a ping at Starbucks, then I couldn't go to Starbucks anymore and I could only go back and forth to Sprouts. So yeah, that's what I did.
Great, it's wonderful. I can't believe we have 3 Sprouts stories in a row. It's great. Anybody else?
Drawing. Can you see mine?
Yeah.
So this is my walking route to this particular spot where there's no one there, but I have to go through certain spots to get there. So I've created a scenario where, I can take this normal walking route so that I would go this, and then 3, 4, and then the 5th one will be the longest route to get to that spot. And I drew these kind of this is where it's like where this is a populated area and a lot of pedestrians walk here.
So you're avoiding that area?
Trying to, but it's like enough distance. Yeah, but it's actually one of the most like remote spots on like housing area that I like to go hide. there's much
that's
people.
great.
So I was like, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Anybody else?
I would also share something.
Okay, great. Hi, Nico.
Hi. So I drew this map. I don't know if, can you see it a bit?
A little more to the, in front of you.
Yeah.
Perfect, yes.
This, okay, great. I'm trying to point. So this is where I live right now. It's an area in Berlin, basically. And what I realized during the lockdown in March, April, May was how important the free, like the open spaces became. So like a bunch of cemeteries over here and a park right here opposite where I live, and the Spree River part, or a channel of the Spree River right here. And then when the lockdown loosened, the library, that I would go over here, and one of the supermarkets would be over here that I would, on my way to many of the open spaces, have to avoid because there are so many people queuing up because they were limiting the access to them. But what is really the place that I cannot avoid at all, but that maybe actually is the most dangerous one, is, or not the most dangerous one, but the most likely to be, where I would be most likely in contact with the virus, is home, actually, because I live with 2 high school teachers and a geriatrics fellow in a hospital.
Wow.
So this is yeah. So this is yeah, I guess a different a kind of monitor of what's going on with the, in terms of the virus events in the city, in a way that that comes home in a way.
Nico, can you point to your home again?
That's the red dot right
there.
there.
The red spot, yeah. So interesting. I love how it's a precipice. Great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Comments? So in this one, we have home being the spot that's the risk center.
I'm going to throw in a Sprouts comment, which is that I was going to go to Sprouts yesterday, and I drove by and saw this long line of people in front waiting to get in. And I thought,
Yes.
I'm just going to drive right past it, go to a different store. So I didn't have to be in a long line of people who knows what their status is, and who knows how long it would take me to even get inside.
Yeah, Sprouts is super popular, that's for sure.
Julie, that's
They
funny.
do have-
That's now why I avoid Trader Joe's.
Yeah, Trader Joe's is even worse.
Yeah. Sprouts does have, not that this is the topic of the talk, Sprouts advertisements, but you can do Instacart, and you can go pick it up from Sprouts, and then it only costs a couple bucks. Like, they'll bring it out to your car. If you're just passing that along.
Oh, that's good to know. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, anybody else? Comments, thoughts?
I'll just share mine because maybe my density differs from this whole situation, and apologize for my envelope. Okay, so I live on, so this is my house here, sorry, here. And then I live on this big park. And so I will have to walk through the park to get to my grocery store, which is right here. And as a COVID survivor, I would say that we're particularly paranoid in my household. And so what I've rendered is more like not the back and forth to the park, but this is kind of like a busy city park that has, you know, moderate density of people. But I think the moment we got the pings, there would be a lot more like even just avoiding people passing by in the park particularly. So even if you're like more than 2 meters or whatever, it would just like, I think like we vary at the extremity of our paranoia of the social distance. And so I think that there's also this like attentiveness and like attention to the information that as it comes in, you also raise and like slightly modify, even if you're being really vigilant or whatever. There's even like an enhanced modification, even if it's not particular to the information itself. So there's just like a change of alertness. So that's just kind of what I wanted to share there. Yeah.
That's great. That's really interesting, Stephanie. And I really appreciate hearing that as a survivor, it's heightened your sense of awareness and care, as opposed to making you more cavalier.
I think that if we were sure that the science was actually a golden ticket, then we would feel differently. Yeah. But I think it's more like never want to experience that ever, ever again.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Jonah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's funny. I started drawing mine, and it's very small actually. It's only sort of a, I don't know how many square blocks that is, but not very many. And so this is my house up here, and we've just moved into this neighborhood. And what it made me think about was how different it is living in Vancouver, which is where I'm originally from and where we're staying now, and we've been since March, compared to Southern California, where everything is so far away, you drive everywhere. And here, one thing that's nice about it is, here's one grocery store, which is a few blocks away. And there, I also wrote in the liquor store. That's a Canadian thing. They're not all in the same place, but it's pretty close by. And the coffee shop. But then I was thinking about, well, what if this is a big main sort of artery here. If there's starting to be pings here, then you can walk, not too far in another direction and go to another grocery store, and they're all within walking distance. But the weird part about being in such a dense city, which I in general really love and value, is all of a sudden you're compared to in Southern California, where I feel like I never encounter somebody on the sidewalk. It's so, you're so spaced out, or you're driving. Here, when we go to walk the dog in the park, which is over here, there's, 100 people always there. And there's people constantly walking down the sidewalk. And the sidewalks and streets are not wide here like they are in California. They're all pretty narrow. And so certain areas of the city become really congested and kind of scary in a different way. And there's an elementary school that's just coming back into session that's around the street. And Fabi, my partner, commented that it's never common that when school is back in session, you see a bunch of kids walking to school. That doesn't seem sinister, except now it kind of has like this really ominous feeling. And there's all these like little kids walking with masks, in lines to the place. And anyways, I think a lot of the things that we really liked about living in a city like this, which is very walkable and everything's close at hand, all of a sudden is turned inside out. And those all seem like threatening, dangerous aspects of being here.
So interesting. California alienation suddenly has a positive side to it, huh?
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting.
So I have a question for you, Lisa.
Yes, please.
So you mentioned about designers needing to have sort of this literacy in data science, and talked about, Amy mentioned algorithmic literacy, critical literacy. So what about the audience? Does the designer have in mind who is getting this information? And if so, should your design change based on that, based on the audience? Or does the designer think about the audience, or?
I would think that the designer would. I have this conversation a lot with Gabi Shafson, who's signed off. And he's teaching design at York in Canada now. And there's the question, we co-taught together once a couple of years ago. And he would always say, yeah, ultimately you're working for your client. And who you're designing for is at the behest of your client. But my feeling is that in a world where we don't just serve industry, we serve ethics as well, that you have to make your call about that. And it may be that there's one particular demographic that the client is aiming for, but you know that your work can reach another group. And so understanding how information narratives structurally work can help you to be able to control that while still doing your job for your client. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think it is the responsibility of the designer to speak to, quote unquote, the audience, but then there's the question, what audience? You know, I'm a business, I want to reach this demographic. Rich white men, no, my business demographic. Well, as a designer, I wouldn't want that to be what I do. And so would I be able to expand the scope of what I'm doing to have a counter message or an alternative audience appeal within my text? This is standard within, you know, media advertising industry, trying to work, you know, in a double-edged way and do a critical intervention. So it's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I think you do gear to the audience, but who that audience is may not be who your client says it is. It may be more than that or more complex than that. And then, you know, like the whole persona exercise, what does your client want? Who is your client? So many assumptions are built into personas that don't really hold across given groups. It's just like the persona exercise is a travesty against Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. Identity is multiple, identity is complicated, identity is intersectional. We often have less in common with people in our own specific cultural group than we do across cultural groups. And yet personas are all about pigeonholing you into your cultural group so that you can be marketed to. So who it is you imagine yourself to market toward is also contingent on what your theory of the human subject is.
Do we ultimately begin to ask algorithmic literacy of our audience, or can we? Because you know, we're always kind of talking about this as practitioners, but you know, thinking back again to media literacy, we hope that audiences will have it, and I feel like we don't yet hope that audiences will have algorithmic literacy.
That's a great question, and do algorithmic you know, designers have responsibility to critical transparency? You know, you can be algorithmically literate, but if the algorithm is non-transparent, you can't go very far with that.
Well, I'm talking about algorithmic literacy in the context of the term meaning like critical ability to critically evaluate an algorithm and understand it in terms of bias. So it's often used like in terms of, you know, why are face recognition algorithms racist? Well, look, they train them on a set of white men, right? And so understanding critically how that algorithm was built helps you understand its implication, or why is this algorithm saying that Black people are less likely to be good risks for parole. That was another one that came up a few years ago. Oh, well, let's see how that algorithm was built. So like using the term meaning that critical algorithmic literacy. And it's something that, you know, that we talk about. We're talking to students, and we're talking to, you know, other academics and practitioners. And, you know, it's been my my interest for many years in seeing that percolate out to audiences, because as young people are growing up understanding more about how algorithms function technically, they should be understanding or able to understand more how they function critically. And yet I feel like that expectation is still just not there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Amy, and I think it really segues with Hij's question about audience, because it requires pedagogy in a multitude of fields, and especially in design, around how algorithms function culturally, how algorithms function politically, sociopolitically. And I don't think there's enough of that to be able to assume that people know without having it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I wonder if I think that needs to change. And I'm just wondering how we get it to, because I mean, I've been talking about this since at least 15, 18 years. That's time for a person to grow up, and it hasn't changed. So, how do we make this change? Oh.
Yeah. Yep. Really important. Those of you who are going to teach, Stephanie, Jonah. Every field for sure.
Yeah. I mean, kindergarten, there should be, there should be like grade school, Yeah. Maybe not kindergarten, but grade school.
Not kindergarten, but grade school for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Stephanie, thank you so much. And Jonah, thank you so much for organizing and hosting. I really appreciate having had this opportunity to present, but especially to chat with all of you who have remained for this studio session. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jonah, Stephanie, everybody that put it together.
Thank you.
I saw it.
Thank you.
Well, everyone.